Everybody. I just saw some questions in the chat. We are good to go. We're still moving and grooving. We're just checking in on our panelists and they are ready. So we're going to have Raven Moore, who is in charge of narrative and movement building here at NBCDI, give us a brief introduction, some bios for our participants, our interviewer, and our panelists as well. And I am going to throw it over to her.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the National Black Child Development Institute's July Virtual Learning Series. The challenges and opportunities, the impact of the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action on Black children and families. Again, just so happy that you can join us for this thought-provoking discussion to explore the impact of the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, examining the challenges that Black children and families will face and the opportunities that will arise. Some of the objectives that we'll be discussing today is just to raise awareness about the impact of the Supreme Court rulings, foster dialogue and learning among participants to aid in continuing advocacy efforts for Black children and families considering the Supreme Court rulings on affirmative action. I am so happy that you all get to just experience, again, such a rich conversation that I'm really looking forward to. Our NBCDI's very own Senior Vice President, Dr. Shauna Knox, to give you a little bit of information about her. She's a researcher, a policy advocate, activist. She's a philanthro advocate and thought leader in Black humanity by way of designated expertise in the decolonization and rehumanization of Black citizens of the global South. Dr. Knox was previously appointed Chief of Strategy at Associated Black Charities, a public foundation committed to the closing of the racial wealth gap in the U.S. through research and practice. She just brings a wealth of knowledge, brilliant leader, and I'm just so excited that you all get a chance to, be in this conversation with her and Dr. Mercer, Dr. Charmaine Mercer, who was our special guest. And again, we'll bring some great, just some great expertise to this conversation. Dr. Mercer is the Chief Equity and Culture, is the Chief of Equity and Culture at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. She serves as an internal resource on racial equity in the foundation's grant making and helps champion and share diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within the foundation. She also oversees external grant making related to racial equity, including a new 10-year, $150 million racial justice initiative. So again, just so excited about this conversation, and I am going to turn it over to Dr. Knox and Dr. Mercer to get this much needed and important conversation started. Hope you all enjoy.
Thank you so much, Raven. And it's a pleasure to be with you today, Dr. Mercer, to have this conversation. You're occupying a really critical position that has the potential to make substantive change in this space of racial equity and justice. And so I think the moment really demands this conversation, and I'm just so happy to be in it with you. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I will apologize now that I'm in a lobby and it's giving a little bit of more noise than I would prefer. So thank you for bearing with me.
That's okay. I'm not hearing a thing, so you're just fine.
Great.
So, Dr. Mercer, so many things to ask here. And so I think I'd like to just start us in rooting us in a conversation about your general story about your own experience in anti-Blackness and how you arrived in this place in this moment.
Yeah, I spent some time reflecting on how would I tell this in a nice, succinct way, or a way that is at least hearable to other people. I think of my story so much in terms of where I'm from. I am from Pasadena, California, and I'm a child of the 70s. I was a product of busing in the 1970s, and as a result of that, it introduced me, kind of changed my life in this really interesting way. Both the busing and put me in schools that I would have normally not kind of had access to. And then also introduced me to a test that I would not have normally had access to, would then kind of put my life in this completely different way. I always think about it as the first time that I had different opportunities and didn't realize that the outcomes would kind of come from that. I had childhood friends who I grew up with, and we rode the bus together and we went to school together. But once we got to school together, we started living just drastically different lives when we were inside of the schoolhouse. But it was from there that I began to kind of understand and really see that there were differences. I just didn't know the why behind the differences. Um, that would perpetuate all the way through high school. Ultimately, me going to college is where I then decided to really think about politics and political science. I was a political science major. All of my educational experience actually has been at the intersection of both kind of politics and education policy. And through all of that, understanding that I was able to kind of navigate through a system in spite of, not because of. The system wasn't actually enabling me. I was able to do some things in spite of because of the people inside of the system. And I think it was throughout all of that, working, going through different colleges and universities, whether it was a public one or a private one. I did both. Working for a large institution, one of my very first jobs out of graduate school was working for the Congressional Research Service, where I did research on behalf of Congress to help them understand kind of minority serving institutions and financial aid. And then I would go from there to working on the Hill. And through all of those different organizations, and they were all different. I was always focused on education, but all of those organizations were different. One of the things that I understood that was common was the people. The people were always common. The systems were different, but the people was what was in common. And I had an opportunity to experience different types of leaders and different types of leadership. And it was there for me that I think it really became grounded in not just anti-Blackness, but how I saw Blackness as trying to lead us towards liberation. And it's understanding the systems. And it was where I would say I then began my path towards what I described as kind of liberated leadership. It's the place where I chose to kind of lead in a different way, to say we can design systems and people to be far more inclusive and collaborative. We can be far more personal and relational in the work that we do. We can have greater self-awareness and team awareness inside of what we do and how we always work together, and doing that with intentionality, which requires, again, that level of awareness. So that's the way I think it's like I've navigated through systems and I've worked in different places, but I've always worked with people. So what I think of it is, how do I see myself, one, as a person, and working with different people so that we can change systems to make them more grounded in fairness and equity as well.
That's a beautiful response, Dr. Mercer. And there's a lovely cross-disciplinarity in you talking about not only your personal experience, but also your experience with foundation and even with policy as a policy major. And I guess it leads us really well to this question when we think about the removal of the intervention, the federal legislative maneuver of affirmative action being removed, being dismissed as unconstitutional. And perhaps this purported idea of race neutrality that would propose that it's not necessary to have that intervention. And you spoke to interventions with the busing, with your introduction to that test. And I wonder what meaning you would invite us to make of the challenges and opportunities in the removal of the intervention of affirmative action in light of your perspective about systemic design for change in the future that we want to see.
Thank you for that. So I would say partly I don't see affirmative action as an intervention. I kind of saw it in higher education as a last stop, as a recognition of a failure of our system to recognize its history and its kind of continued perpetuation of that. So that by doing it, it was like, because we have failed to recognize the impact of slavery, because we continue to fail to recognize that there are differences in race and differences in economic groups. The least we can do is when those students are able to make it to college, we're able to have some policy in place that will try to recognize that. So that's the way I've always kind of viewed affirmative action, is like this very last stop of what we can do because we failed all along the way to do anything about it. So if you accept that frame for a minute, there's so much more that we can do, right? We can actually create opportunities for children, Black children, to have fundamentally different experiences. Like the reason we even thought about affirmative action as a remedy is because Black children, Latino children, lots of children who had less access to opportunities are applying to college, and their transcripts and their complete package is reflective of the fact that they traverse systems that were not designed to support them and ensure that they could actually arrive at college. So if we did something to fix that, right? So from a systems level perspective, if we did something to fix that, we might need that less, right? By the time kids got to college, you might need that less. So what might that look like? Like universal pre-K would be a place where you could begin. I mean, even I would go back even earlier if we thought about early healthcare intervention. Some of this goes all the way back. We know it goes back to children in the womb. If we are ensuring maternal health is actually a priority, children enter the world, which is vastly different chances of success. So I would say that rather than relying upon a last stop remedy, I think the opportunity now is for us to change the way that we think about our early childhood as well as our K-12 system as a whole, and stop thinking of it as kind of fragmented parts. The fact that we still say early K-12 and higher ed as though we're not having this kind of continuum of learning, I think that is one kind of opportunity challenge to take. I think there's also an opportunity challenge to think about the way we view and understand higher education more broadly. We have institutions, minority serving institutions, whether they are historically Black colleges and universities, whether they're Hispanic serving institutions and university or institutions, or whether they're tribal colleges and universities, Alaska Native, there's predominantly Black institutions. There's so many other institutions that their primary mission, if not over time, just the evolution of the population of students who they serve and who they see as fulfilling their mission. These are great institutions of learning. And so how we conceptualize and bring those into the fore of how we think about the educational experiences of our children, I think is also an opportunity for us to think about that as well. I will end a little bit with the challenges. It's hard for me to sometimes just only focus on the challenges, but I will say in California, where Proposition 209 outlawed affirmative action several years ago, we have seen a reduction at the UC system in Black and Brown students' attendance. But in our private colleges and our community colleges, students there thrive. So again, I think it's an opportunity for us to think about which institutions of learning are really situated to best support the needs of our kids as well. I'll stop there. And
no, that response is extremely generous. And I think it leads well to my next question, because the proposed solutions that you've offered here, universal pre-K, early healthcare interventions, and even thinking about historically Black colleges and institutions, I suppose my thinking is sitting atop a $150 million racial justice initiative in the philanthropic space. I guess I'm wondering what the moral imperative here is from the vantage point of philanthropy. And I actually also invite you to, you said you don't like to exclusively speak to challenges, but to kind of orient us, give us the backstage view here of what's happening from that space of philanthropy that's setting aside $150 million for racial justice. Are we seeing any movement in response to this? What does that movement look like? And what are some of the obstacles that perhaps prevent things from flowing as they should?
Certainly. So I'm going to answer that in both ways because you asked for philanthropy. And then when you said the 150, that would be specific to Hewlett. So I'll try to do both as much as I can do a Jabberwock. In between, I'll start maybe internally or start with us. So when the foundation made its commitment initially to something called racial justice, like many others, we're brand new to this space. So what does that even mean? How do you even begin? Um, as a Black woman, I'm also fully cognizant. Let me go back. As a Black woman with a lot of degrees and certification, and who, now lives at an income that is not reflective of my past and certainly not reflective of what majority of Americans experience, I'm fully aware that I'm not immune to the impacts of systemic racism. Right? I've been socialized by the same institutions as many of my white colleagues. So I share that as a way of saying that internal learning and having your own way of knowing what you go through and what your experience and where your blind spots are is just critically important. So having like a group of people who support you and your team and your learning is critically important. So at Hewlett, as the leader of this work at the foundation, all of our teams are integrating learning inside of what they do. And it's not just our grant making team, it's our admin and operations team because we're one foundation. So we want the whole foundation to work to do its part to address injustice inside of our systems. But you can't just expect people to know what to do. I don't believe people are sitting around knowing like the best answer and they just choose not to use the best answer. I fundamentally believe most people don't know what they're doing isn't the best thing to do and giving them ways of understanding that. So at Hewlett, we are undertaking this process where all 18 of our teams have to interrogate their policies and practices as they pertain to their programs and their people and partners. And based on that, kind of looking at their data and how they're doing, they have to make a decision on what they want to work on. And once they make that decision and then they begin to live into that decision, and it's something around racial equity, they have to make something and they're going to work on it. Once they begin to live into that decision, and it probably takes about 4 to 7 months or so, they then have to share across the foundation in a public space what they chose, how they got to making the choice, and then something they're wrestling with, something that they're still finding that's hard as they're going through it. At Hewlett, we call that a presentation of learning. All 18 of our teams are doing that. We do about 1 to 2 of them every month. In fact, my team, August 1st, first team to go to kick it off. That cycle that I just described, we'll do that every 2 years, about every 18 to 24 months, and it's ongoing because there's never an opportunity to not look at what you're doing. So that's one piece, and then it's combined with the presentations of learning that goes on. So even those of us who are on the grant making team, myself, you're still doing that same interrogation. So when you're thinking about your grant making, you're never saying, just because I'm a Black woman, I have all the answers, I know how to do it. It's like, no, let's think about this, let's be thoughtful. So internal learning is a big, 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 big piece. I am aware of smaller private foundations who are doing internal learning, perhaps reading groups, organized learning. They're doing kind of field trips together where they're having opportunities to learn. Less so at national foundations like Hewlett is what I will say. When it comes to thinking about how to do this work at Hewlett and how we've chosen to do this work at Hewlett, the 150 million was set up initially for 10 years. So you get 10 years to spend $150 million. At Hewlett, we spend that much like every year. So that's actually not like a big deal, right? So the big deal is, can we get this as a systemic level? That's what we're really trying. So that goes back to kind of my systems level piece, hence the education and the learning piece, they're connected. So in my mind, if people inside the foundation are working overtime over this 10-year period every year to deepen some inequity or unearth some inequity and deepen justice inside of what they do, and then the grantees who we're working with, which I'll come to the grant making and how we put those together, I feel like this becomes a part of like our bloodstream. We have this statement that we've developed, and it says like in 5 years, basically my position won't even be needed because everyone will so understand kind of how to do this that we are able to do this on our own. I always say in an ideal world, my position, the part of my position that focuses on equity is because my title is the Chief of Equity and Culture. My hope is that in 5 years, the part that says, that calls out equity will not be needed, but culture is something that's always ongoing. And that in 5 years, that understanding racial equity is a part of our culture, and that there will be someone at the foundation who is actually working to maintain that. So the obstacles is where I'll then go. The obstacles to this are learning, adult learning, disrupting people's beliefs. These are very strong held beliefs. People don't just wake up on a Tuesday and decide like, oh, I want to unearth everything that I've ever thought and believed. So how do you do that in ways that don't put people on the defense and have them to kind of become more entrenched in their thinking? How do you create the space for real authentic learning? The good news is, I mean, we're a foundation, so we have a lot of money. So I'm going to name that. And that's always my reason for why everything is possible. When I worked in the nonprofit space where we had like a fixed amount of money, I didn't have all day sometimes to sit and figure out the world's problems and help each individual figure out their life path to working on equity. But I work for a foundation. If we have $14 billion endowment, we have time. We have time. So we sit down and we think about ourselves, and we sit down and we have people who help us see ourselves when we can't see ourselves, as a way of not disrupting the work. I'm so excited to share though that it's actually working. It's working. It's
I,
it's not easy, but I will just say
yeah.
it's actually working. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And that was a really helpful answer. There was a proliferation of thoughts in my mind as you were talking. And I think I will start here with just this thought that I'm noting that the initiative is specifically for racial justice as opposed to racial equity. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm wondering I'm thinking about justice as requiring like a retrospective righting of wrongs, and then also a forward-facing march towards a sustainably different future. And as I'm thinking about specifically like this affirmative action decision, and us acknowledging that it, however imperfect, it had a place in acknowledging the just overall failure of the country to attend to the needs of Black students and certainly other students, but for National Black Child Development Institute, that's where we're going to land the plane. And so I suppose that I'm thinking about like what justice means for this specific reality, and what a systemic maneuver toward justice might look like, even in reference to what you're saying about systems change really at its root, referring to like shifting of mental models, and just thinking about what our imperatives are, that will make systemic change that doesn't purport that, oh, something's wrong with Black people and that's why they need extra help, but rather like speaking to the overlapping realities, oppressive realities that create a situation in which if you have made something wrong, you must then make it right. So I guess I'm questioning in that allocation and investment in justice, like what would be just for Black children and families. I'm wondering what you're observing, and I'm wondering if in the shift towards justice, the systemic shift towards justice, what the shift in mental models and narratives ought to be, in your opinion, in order to move us towards the reality that in which you discuss your position doesn't even really need to exist. Just curious about those learnings that are kind of happening inside of the foundation.
No, that's a fair question. I agree with you. The justice part is notable. There's a thing where I would say, racial equity, at least to me, suggests implies that the systems that we have now where there are racialized differences, if we simply, tinker with those systems or try to modify those systems, that those systems then will be fine. It's hard for me to see where systems that were designed kind of at their origins to not be inclusive and to not represent certain people, that if you just tinker with that in it of itself would be fine. Whereas justice to me recognizes that even if it's at the root of that system, if that system isn't perfect, there's a way that a new collective finds a way towards what's just. So that's part of what I see in the future facing piece, and how you think about the work involving justice is that you bring more people into deciding what the future looks like and how do we do that. So for me and at the foundation, the way we think about the internal work is everyone who wants to be a part, let's do it. I always say, like, as long as you want to get on the bus, let's get on the bus. There's a seat for you on the bus. But when you tell me you don't want to get on the bus, and then there's lots of different ways you can tell me that, right? Like there's lots of different ways of people saying when they don't want to get on the bus. I'm kind, so I'll try to encourage you one more time to come with us. But should you say no, then there's things that we'll do, and the bus is going towards the future. And the way that we say it at Heal It is that if you could imagine a world where all of the isms that have disrupted this world, right? So racism, sexism, the economic oppression and capitalism that we all continue to live under. If those things hadn't created, what would the world look like? Like, well, we would never know. We will literally never know the demography, topography of that island. But we know there's a whole bunch of stuff that if we just kept doing, we would get closer and closer. So our work is figuring out what's our role and getting closer and closer and closer to that island. And in your domain, so if your domain is investments, what can you do to get us closer? If your domain is education, what can you do to get closer? Our education team is an example where they have said, we had this strategy a couple of years ago that focused on what we defined as deeper learning. It was really a great education. Like every kid gets to have something that's designed for them. They have ways in making education meaningful. It's often based in their community. It has relevance. They're working with educators who care. Really just a great education. Several years ago, the team that was at Hewlett had come up with this really good strategy, and it worked in particular settings. Well, this particular team said, well, let's see if we can come up with something and go to a community, let them work in partnership with us to design what would work for them. That would be their version of something called deeper learning. And then let's see if that can grow. Let's go to communities where they often don't get those experiences, Jackson, Mississippi, Baltimore, Maryland, and let's see if those communities and those administrators can actually work in partnership with us to come up with something. It's working. It takes time because these systems are deeply entrenched. Philanthropy itself, people have different ways of understanding us and working with us. It takes a long time for us to convince people that we are being very genuine when we say we want to work in partnership, because many of us don't. We say we want to work in partnership, and then we come and we're really directive about what it is we want. But we are also really committed to building trusting relationships, and that seems to have paid off too. So that's what I guess I would say is that the shifting of the narrative, shifting of the work, when it's the people who are actually doing it and it's their lives, that's where it is. The challenge comes in being patient enough to figure out the path towards the collective getting what it is that they want.
I love that answer. Thank you for sharing that. And I think what it brings to mind, especially when you're talking about like entrenched ideology within philanthropy that in fact works against what philanthropy sometimes is externally saying like it is trying to do. I think I want to ask you to put on your funder hat now to answer this question. And I want to recognize, Dr. Mercer, that you're coming from the other side and that you were in nonprofits and you've crossed over. So I'm going to lean on your expertise in both areas here and value both. But here is my question. When it comes to funding those innovative systemic shifting ideas that are actually going to make a meaningful difference for students who are no longer benefiting from affirmative action as a mechanism just to acknowledge the overlapping oppressive realities that often lock them out of opportunities, period. People who care about this, who are, trying to work meaningfully towards this, tend to be historically and categorically, manifestly underfunded, right? Even when we're thinking about like historically Black colleges and institutions, it's just a fact that they are just so grossly underfunded that though they're doing such critical, work to support and catch all for when our country has a societal failure like the one that we're in right now, they're ready to like catch us all, but they're kind of doing it with 2 buckets in a basket. And so as I'm thinking about even my vantage point, we're a national civil rights organization led by a Black leader and serving Black people across the nation. And primarily our staff is also Black people. And the funding reality, if social science will bear out, that any institution that looks like that and functions like that is just perpetually underfunded. And so there is sort of like a looking toward like, okay, there is a need now for a systemic maneuver to happen. And the people on the front line who have been caring about Black children and families and thinking about their needs, we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to truly use their expertise to present an option that is workable. I think my question is, in thinking about that reality of these institutions that are trying to tackle and grapple with issues of racial injustice, in this particular case, affirmative action no longer existing. I suppose my question is like, what's the thing that changes that from inside philanthropy with those entrenched ideologies? And frankly, just the convenience of people fund who they were funding before, and then they just keep on funding them forever. And so even though I do appreciate that in the larger scope of how much philanthropies as large as Hewlett have in their coffers, $150 million over 10 years, it's not as breathtaking as we may have wanted it to be, but it is something. And so I wonder, it's sitting from your seat, and I know you can appreciate what I'm saying because you are on the other side as well. I know I'm not presenting something new. I guess, like, what can you shout back from the other side about what allows us to not just do the labor of discovering what needs to be done, but also to receive the funding to do that work without kind of spending inordinate amounts of time shouting into the void that this is a solution, this is what we need to do, but not getting funded to be able to do it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's just the reality. The report from Echo and Green and Bridgespan, vetted that out, that organizations led by people of color overwhelmingly have less access to, I would just say less access to philanthropy in general. The thing I start with, so if I could offer some form of guidance, direction, and then keeping in mind, I should have said this, I've only worked for one foundation. We have this thing where we say in philanthropy, if you worked at one foundation, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. So I've only worked for Hewlett. So keep everything that I'm up there in mind. That's the only place I've ever worked. It's a relationship. And I didn't realize that when I was in the nonprofit world, but then when I got to the film, I was like, oh, okay, it's the same. The challenge being for us, and I'll go back and say more about the relationship. The challenge being for us is there's not that many people of color in philanthropy. So then our ability to only make relationships, that's not enough. And so then connecting with people who don't look like us, that can be a barrier sometimes for us. What I would say there is spend time on relationships. Understand what their strategies are. Understand what the organization funds. Listen to what the organization's reputation is. If you believe you're special and unique, and that's the way you want to seek your funding opportunities, go for it, but there's a price to pay. for that. I always tell people, you know, philanthropy has a bit of a herd mentality. Someone shared that with me that I appreciated. So when you find the funders who travel in the way that you like to travel, hang out with that group and find ways of making relationships with them. Find one person, and that person can become your person to then connect you to other people. Be very clear about what it is you're asking for. As I always tell people, if your ask is that you don't have an ask, if your ask is that, hey, I just want to get to know you, I just want to go for coffee, and there is no ask, say that. And then it frees the person on my side up. I've observed several of my colleagues, not just at Hewlett, but still, you know, across the philanthropic sector, they struggle with conflict and difficulty. So it's hard for them to tell people, oh, I can't fund you. It's hard for them to tell people you're not in my strategy. It's hard to be. So if you can't put anyone in a position, but if the words you share with people or the way you present something leads them to interpret that they're in a now difficult situation, the end result for you is still the same. They won't respond. And you want a response, even if the response is no. I tell people it's helpful to get a no because you can then move on to the next person versus continuing to follow up and follow up. But find the funders who support the work in the way that you do it. And that's where I'll end this part is be clear about what it is you do. When you know what it is you do, and then you understand what their strategy is, find the funders who respect what you do in that way. Don't do the square peg, round hole. Yeah, I know it's completely unfair. Yes, it's extractive, but I'm not sure that's the best use of your time is to try to find, you know, force someone to recognize what it is you do. Find the funders who fund what you want. Okay, I said that was the last thing. This is the last thing. If what you do, your idea, uh, I try to give this visual. Funders are concerned kind of in a commensurate way where they fund. So if your solution, if your project is fixing something inside of a particular school, the funders in that region, in that community, they care about that. A national funder is less likely to care about that unless that city happens to be one of the cities that funder is focused on. Similarly at the state level, just keep going up, like regionally, like make sure your work has a focus for what it is they want to focus on. So you're not spending your time trying to, again, force yourself into particular parts of the strategy where there really is no fit, given the way that organization funds. I'll stop there.
No, that was really helpful, Dr. Mercer, and thank you. We actually have a question coming in from the chat that I want to make sure that we have a chance to incorporate as we're winding down. It says, Dr. Mercer, in early childhood education, we often discuss nature versus nurture. What were some of the leaps of faith that you incorporated in your journey that kept you going in the different environments if nurturing may not have been in the midst?
Oh, that's a great question. Really, that's a really good question. You know what, to be quite honest, when I like to say that I grew up professionally in DC. That's where, and I didn't even know, I didn't even have the expectation, to be quite honest, that there would be someone kind of there, kind of fostering and supporting me along the way. So when you don't know what you don't know, I have an orientation. I've done this assessment. I would strongly encourage everyone, if you've never heard of it, there's this assessment called the Enneagram. It really is about kind of motivations. When I took my Enneagram and I was like, oh my God, everything about me made so much more sense. So then it made sense that I never thought about the fact that there was someone there to nurture and support me. So I've always just kind of made it through in spite of. But then there was a moment in my life, and it was actually when I was preparing to go to Hewlett. And then when I got to Hewlett, when I looked back kind of retrospectively, where I realized, wow, it would have been really nice to have thought about this. It would have really been nice. And so from that point on, then my life work became doing the thing that I wish that I had always had in other people. So supporting women of color in positions of leadership literally is like kind of my personal mission.
That's a wonderful answer. I want to think about who our audience today and what they might be kind of joining us to hear. I'm sure we have a number of educators amongst us, as well as other advocates who are just interested in this space. And I suppose I wonder from you if what you think a good intervention, if I can call back to that word from the very beginning, a good intervention for Black children and families and those who care for them ought to look like in this new landscape in which we find ourselves, where affirmative action is no longer a reality. I wonder what advice you might give as the person that you wish you had along the way for our families that are navigating this terrain without really an understanding of what things mean, because that's still developing.
That's a great one to kind of chew on a bit. So I think education is still largely a state and local matter at the end of the day. So that's kind of where I start when I think about parents and families. I really do think it's critically important to put forward greater opportunities to learn for Black children. I mean, for all children, but again, in this context, for Black children, you just can't underestimate, and you all know this, the importance of really like starting children off with a really solid start. Parents can get actively involved in the curriculum choices that are being made inside of their school districts. Again, these are localized decisions that are happening sometimes at the state level, finding out, again, who the educators and administrators are, who are also working with our children as a part of that, I think are all ways of shaping that overall educational experience. There was another piece when you think about college attendance that is about telling your story and having other people help you tell your story. So that is both your personal statement and your references. We come from communities that are rich in their own ways. And so how do we engage with communities to be references for our children as they go out into the world? And then the other side of that is how do we help them to tell their stories as a part of a personal statement, because it is their personal story. And I think that's a story that's worth uplifting. And then I will end with saying, raising children to be advocates. Raising children, it's like, if we don't like the Supreme Court that we have, like, well, any of us who are working with young kids, that's who we're talking about. So helping children to understand what injustice looks like and feels like, we all experience it on any given day, so that this shapes them and molds them in the same way that it did many of us in this space to do the things that we do today.
That's wonderful. It seems we have another question from the audience. This question is about Hewlett specifically, it seems. It says, within the assessment of the 18 teams addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, what are some of the initiatives that have been really successful for achieving justice for all?
So yeah, I'll give an example from one of our grant making teams and their strategies, and then from our admin teams. I think I can do this correctly in my head. Let me write that one down. So on one of our grant making teams, we have a team that's called the Effective Philanthropy Group. If you thought about who their grantees are, they decided this is in their strategies. All of us have strategies too that govern what we do. So yes, democracy, but there's like a particular part of democracy that we'll focus on. So for the Effective Philanthropy Group, knowledge was one of their strategies. The word is knowledge, information. Under their last strategy, they chose to prioritize philanthropy. So that meant they were doing knowledge for philanthropy. So you have a funder with a lot of money taking all of their money to go out and get knowledge for other people who have a lot of money. Okay, that's how it's been happening for quite some time. This different crew came on and they're like, wait, what? Like, that's how we're like, what about helping the people in the world who are seeking, figure out what we're doing and how we can better support them? So they completely shifted their strategy, and rather than having it knowledge centered on philanthropy, it's knowledge centered on the people, which when I heard it, I almost felt like, are you serious? But yes, like centering knowledge and caring about the people who we are as funders, the money is being a tax deduction. So it makes sense that you would have this in some way. So that's one way around our grant making. And then all the grant making now that goes in the research is all funded now for the people as opposed to in that way. So that's one. And another one of our grant making teams that works in the Global South, uh, a thing that they did in their most recent one was change their application, their proposal. Not only did they reduce it greatly, but they also changed it so that it's all in different languages and there's no interpretation. All of that occurs not on Hewlett's dime as opposed to the grantees. And then the final one that I always like to mention, we travel. There's 125 or so people who work for the foundation. Maybe about a third of them travel internationally pretty regularly. And then some people do just for personal reasons. We had this glitchy system that the minute you would go to another country, it would start sending you all these notices on your phone. Like, don't do this, don't. Well, our more junior staff, when they would travel, it would drive their behavior. They would be standing outside of hotels, trying to be on the free Wi-Fi, driving to a local Starbucks, doing all these different, our directors, they would see it and they would just delete it and keep moving and never shifted their behavior. The IT team, when they recognized that was happening as a part of this framework, they just recently implemented a new system that doesn't require any pre-notification. Everybody can just go. There's a way that they'll do the monitoring to let you know. So it just frees everyone up from the worrying, because they recognize at different levels of in the foundation, people were having fundamentally different experiences. So those are two examples of it.
Dr. Mercer, this has been really a really deeply inspiring conversation. I know I'm personally grateful that you're in that position, doing that work on behalf of all of us. It is very important, and we will take the 150 million that we get. We'll just take it. So I'm glad that that work is under your charge. I think as I'm walking away, I'm most encouraged by you talking about really thinking about a fundamentally different system for Black children and families that doesn't purport to kind of just patch holes, but just thinking about what is the great perhaps here. And at NBCDI, we're really committed to world building towards a future in which not just, Black people exist in, but that we're thriving in and not just surviving in. And so that Afrofuturist lens of operation is certainly pleased in view of the work that you're attempting to do here. And so I really thank you for your time, and thank you for your gracious answers to our questions and to the questions of the folks who have also generously shared themselves with us today to listen in to how we might respond to a suboptimal situation with our best strategy so that we can bring our best selves to our children. So thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Knox, and everyone in NBCDI for inviting me. This was a great conversation. Wishing you all a great rest of your day. So thank you.